Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck. And last time I talked about chapters 2 and 3 of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so today I'm going to talk about chapters 4 and 5. But I failed to mention something at the end of chapter 3 that I think is really important. And that is during the conversation that Atticus has with Scout, and they talk about the Ewells and all that. You know, it started because she said, you know, the teacher says we can't read together anymore. And this is really where Scout gets her education. This is why she's so smart. And Atticus' response is, do you know what a compromise is? And what he does is he compromises with her to say, we will keep doing this, but don't tell the teacher, because I wouldn't want her after me. Now, if you think about the teacher and Atticus, Atticus is, at least it'd be fair to say, more mature and more experienced. After all, how did he learn? You know, they didn't have the Dewey Decimal, and he's, you know, extremely articulate, as were so many others before upper administration got involved in education. So, but the point I want to make is that he's far beyond above people like me who would probably call and say, what the hell is wrong with you? Just move her to another grade. But this shows his humility. This is one of the first times he talks to his daughter, and that you get a sense of who he is as a father. And there's always this underlining integrity and humility behind the way he treats people. You know, he doesn't act like he's above everyone else, even though he kind of is. So this is what she is looking up to, this kind of response. There's one thing she says later on. There just wasn't anything that Atticus couldn't explain. I don't know if that's the exact quote, but it was like there was nothing that could come up in my life and in drama that my father couldn't give some wisdom to. So I just wanted to point that out. And also, she makes an interesting comment. This sounds more like the older Scout looking back, but you can still kind of hear the child in her as well. And see if this doesn't remind you of what school is like. Indeed, there were endless projects that slowly evolved into a unit, in which miles of construction paper and wax crayon were expended by the state of Alabama in its well-meaning but fruitless efforts to teach me group dynamics. And you know, everybody wants you to do these projects, and so it looks like, you know, you really did something. But you know, just like I do, how those projects come to be. And they don't have the depth. It's like on the appearance, everything looks, oh, great. But when it really comes down to it, and I tutor students and I said, well, what did you discuss? They don't really know. They're like, we made a public service announcement. Maybe something very unrelated. So here's the other thing. As for me, I knew nothing except for what I gathered from Time magazine and reading everything I could lay my hands on at home. But as I inched sluggishly along the treadmill of Macomb County school system, I could not help receiving the impression that I was being cheated out of something. Out of what, I knew not. Yet I did not believe that 12 years of unrelieved boredom was exactly what the state had in mind for me. And you know, the ironic thing is, a lot of administrators, speaking from my perspective in Texas, don't believe the classics are relevant. And they're always saying something that's exactly what is going on today, because systems are systems. They don't really change that much. The circumstances changes, but it's still the same kind of idiotic approach to solving a problem in the most kind of superficial way. And that's what makes people hate education. That's what people hate school. Because if they were excited about something that like sparks something and they go, ooh, wow, I never thought about that before. That's a good feeling. That feels good, right? So at any rate, okay, I'm not going to go off on that today. So there's not a lot that happens in the chapter, but the plot sort of thickens a little bit. And that is when they find the gum and then later the pennies, the Indian pennies, from the Radley tree. And there's this like knot hole in it, and the kids find it. And so because things keep showing up, they eventually sort of figure out that maybe Boo is putting those things in for us. And this gets their imagination going, and you see Dill comes back, as she says. Dill came back in a blaze of glory, and he had, talked about his adventures, and he says that he met his dad, and his dad was tall and had a black beard, which doesn't sound like Dill's father would look like anyways. And later, Scout catches him in a lie about his dad. The question here, though, is why does Dill lie about his life? If you've ever known anyone who likes to make up stories a lot, and you say, well, I did this, and then they say, well, I did. I did that. It's really insecurity. And when you are a child and you don't have a family, you're just sort of being pushed from one relative to another. This is very common, because he's got to make it up himself. He's got to prove that I'm okay, and that's why he tells these lies. So the other thing that you start to see is a shift in Jim and Dill wanting to play with themselves, like boys often do at this age. They don't want the little sister around. And you meet Miss Maudie, who lives across the street. And this is someone who Scout can go to. And you start to see that Scout is growing up a little bit herself. She mentions that she really didn't have it in her to provoke Calpurnia anymore. She's liking having some kind of feminine conversation. Maybe even if it's a little bit domestic. It's, she's a tomboy, and she's against it, and she doesn't want to be a lady. But at the same time, she looks at Miss Maudie, who does look like a lady, but also wears overalls. And she's sort of the nonconformist. You see this kind of underlining theme of the people who are alienated are the ones who don't do what everyone else does. So she doesn't go to church on Sundays. Doesn't mean she's not religious. She does know the Bible. But she doesn't go to church. And she spends all her time in her garden. And she makes a comment that these, what they called back then, foot washing Baptists, I don't know if that is still around, but they were apparently very strict. And she said that they told her that her flowers were going to hell, and that she was, of course. And she says something very interesting. She says that they believe that women in general are sin. Now, what does she mean by that? This is hard to explain without going into feminism. And when I talk about feminism, what I do is I typically start with double standards, just so we can get some kind of agreement here, And so if I ask the class, what would happen to a girl if she was promiscuous and, say, slept with a bunch of guys? And she would get a bad reputation, and she'd probably be called a whore. And then I would say, but what would happen if it was a guy? And one of my students said, what would we call him? And one of my students said, legend. So there you have it. there is a double standard. And I want to preface this also by saying, if I bring up a theory, I'm not trying to convert you any more than I am if I bring up something in the Bible. Theories are theories. They're not meant to say, okay, if you learn this, you will be a communist. It's just a lens. It's nothing to be threatened by. The only people who find it threatening are the ones who, A, can't think critically, and B, don't think independently. So they think this is how education works. But it doesn't work that way. I heard many theories growing up and going to college. I had some very peculiar, opinionated professors that were just like way over the top. And, I'm still able to think. So it was okay. So anyways, so the theory here, though, if you think about maybe just even the beginning, the story of Adam and Eve. Who tempts Adam? Eve. Eve's the one who's weak. In Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, it's actually kind of interesting conversation. He sort of fictionalizes this, and she goes off by herself because she says, hey, I want to work alone, And Adam is afraid of this because he's like, well, wait a minute, you're a woman. Something could happen. You can't trust yourself. And something does happen. And then when they start blaming each other and pointing the finger at each other, she said, well, you shouldn't have let me go work by myself. And but the curious thing about this, if you analyze it, is the desire is not in the woman, it's really in the man. And she's just the object of his affection. But she needs to be careful about being that object so that he's okay. And so, as far as blaming, you see this, what the kind of feminism that I look at is mostly like French feminism, which is really just about the relationship with the mother. And it's more about identity than equality, because the identity is what makes the inequality happen. So the expectation of the mother is different. The best example of this is A Doll's House. And when Nora, she abandons her husband and kids, she leaves. This was so controversial that even an actress or two who was supposed to play Nora wouldn't take the role unless they changed it. If you do that, then it changes the entire meaning of the work. And if it were a man who left and abandoned his wife and kids, there wouldn't have been this huge controversy. Okay, so there again lies the double standard. So if you think that this isn't real, then what you need to do is prove that there are no double standards. And that's kind of hard to do. So the point is to figure out, well, but how do these things? It's a tradition of a patriarchal society that feeds us this, and it's, even though we've come a long way from it, there's still just an underlining expectation of belief about what women should do and what men should do. And this is all very relevant to Scout because she's struggling with the fact that she's supposed to be a lady. And this is supposed to be all she is in life. To be pleasing to other people. As her aunt will tell her later, you're supposed to be the sunshine in your father's life. And not wear pants. And, dress like this, you serve men, you do those things. And this is kind of like anybody that tells you what you need to be, even if you're a guy, and let's say you have a father who's always telling you what you need to do, who you need to be, it's uncomfortable because it's not right. Because nobody can tell you that. Nobody can understand your own potential, which is why it's not good to look for the approval of others. I was just reading this story in the New Yorker that came out a long time ago, but in the story, the guy, his mother is in a nursing home, and all his life he's tried to impress her, get her approval, and she's always made up her mind that he's a loser. So he says, and she's very old now, "Mom, I made it. I'm in the New York Times. Last year I won Pulitzer Prize." And she said, "Who are you?" And that's my little anecdote to getting other people's approval. It will never work. It never does. So best thing you can do is just be yourself. And so looking at someone like Maudie, who doesn't care what the neighbors think, she's secure enough in her own skin to almost think it's funny. And that's when you've arrived to maturity, is when it really just doesn't matter. It's just sort of comical. And she's also sets herself apart because later on she's the only one that doesn't go to the trial. She already knows what she's going to see, and she doesn't want to see it. And she knows the kind of man that Atticus is. While other people are upset with him, she's proud of him. And so this is giving, the society view, and then looking at people who are sort of becoming heroic to Scout. And Scout's going to have to decide this for herself when the students start picking on her, because her dad is very unpopular. And it's going to hurt. But at the same time, she's got to learn to go beyond it. And that's part of her coming of age, is seeing Atticus differently. And that'll kind of come up in the next few chapters. The other thing that Maudie tells Scout is what, not the whole story of Boo Radley, but she's basically pointing out that his name is Arthur, and he's a human being. And I talk about this in the introduction if you want to go back and look, but basically what happened is he got into some mischief, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. But the boys were going to be sent to this industrial school, which would have been actually a good opportunity in the end. But because Mr. Radley was prejudiced, he said he didn't want his son, along the black kids who went. And so I know what I'll do. I'll just put him in the basement, and nobody will ever see him again. I'll make sure he goes to prison. He'll be prisoned in his own home, and throw away the key and keep him out of society. So, like I point out in that other lecture, the punishment does not fit the crime. And again, you have this alienated person, this isolated person. So Maudie says if if he wasn't crazy, he's got to be now. Because people do need the community. And so she is kind of humanizing Boo Radley. See, right now he's a myth. And people only see him, and they make stories about that. And the stories there's probably better versions of the story that comes up, because that's part of the projection and the imagination of the people. But you don't really see him. He kind of keeps coming back, but you see more in the end. The story comes full circle. So just keep that in mind. But in the meantime, they decide to play the game of the Boo Radley, where they reenact the scene that they heard from gossip. And they got the scissors, and Scout's got to play Mrs. Radley. She's got to play all the woman roles, obviously, during this time. And Atticus kind of catches on because he sees the scissors and he knows the stories. So what eventually happens is they want to give him a note to get him to come out. Now, part of this is innocent, but Atticus also knows that part of it isn't. part of it is to feed your own desire to exploit him, because this is fun. You're making fun of him, and Jim says, we're not making fun of him. Then what are you doing? And he falls for this, lawyer trick, and he gets angry later on when Atticus says, do you want to be a lawyer, don't you? And Jim later on, out of earshot, says, well, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but I don't know if I want to be one now. And it's not Atticus's fault, it's his own embarrassment that you made me feel this way. And this is part of coming of age as well. But I like what Atticus says, because he says, putting his life's history on display for the edification of the neighborhood. And I just want to talk about your vocabulary for just a second. The edification for the edification of the neighborhood. He's being sarcastic. Edification is more like if somebody gave a homily that was just beautiful, or you had an epiphany. It's like higher up learning. So he's using it sarcastically. You could say that something is very edifying, to use it as a verb. Now, if I just gave you some words to say, memorize the definitions, I don't know that it ever works that way. The way that I've learned words is by memorizing them in context in a book. I remember that he said that, so that when I need to use the word and being sarcastic with my own children, then I can say edification of the neighborhood. And they don't realize where I got it. Well, my daughter might know, but you see what I mean? Most people who are not reading classic literature have no idea where you're coming up with this stuff. I happened to come across something from Jordan Peterson, and it was a motivational speech, but what he was talking about was just how powerful it is to be literate. It's the reason why people listen to Martin Luther King. It's the reason people listen to Malcolm X. Nobody else was going to listen to a black guy in the 60s. Okay? But and they did. They had a better vocabulary than their opponents. So guess who wins? Guess who gets to be heard? Words are power, and you have to be very careful with them. But they will bring you to a different level, because whether you think communication is something of the past, it's not. We have different ways of communicating, but people can tell your education level by the way you write and by the way you speak. So another just encouragement for me to say, read the classics. It doesn't matter who wrote them. Even George Orwell said about Dickens that Dickens was a great person to steal from. Okay? This gives you an edge. It's certainly going to give you an edge in your writing, and that is writing a letter of introduction or whatever to a college or to a job, or a cover letter. It's important. And since so many people have stopped doing it, all the more reason for you to do it, right? Because then you'll definitely stand out. I think that's all for today, because I went pretty long. And so I will pick up next time with chapters 6 and 7. All right? Thanks. Have a good day.